Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third in this year's series, How I Think About Literature. Today, we will hear from Professor Joan Ramon Resina of the Departments of Iberian and Latin American Cultures and Comparative Literature. He specializes in modern European literatures and cultures with an emphasis on the Spanish and Catalan traditions. He's director of the Catalan Observatory here at Stanford, and he also serves as director of the Iberian Studies program that's housed at FSI in the Freeman Spogli Institute. Professor Resina is the author of many monographs and edited volumes in many languages, which I don't really speak. And I considered reading the titles out loud, and then I felt that I didn't want to take time away from his talk. So I will just say that you should go to our new website and see the list of his publications. Most recently, he is the author of Del Hispanismo a los Estudios Ibéricos, una propuesta federativa para el ámbito cultural, where he lays out a rationale for the overcoming of Hispanic studies by a new discipline of Iberian studies. Another recent publication of his is Barcelona's Vocation of Modernity, Rise and Decline of an Urban Image, which traces the development of Barcelona's modern image through texts that foreground key social and historical issues. He has taught before coming to Stanford at Cornell, SUNY Stony Brook, Northwestern. He's received many awards. Let us welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gabriela. Well, first of all, for the invitation to speak tonight, and to all of you for being here. There is just one tiny correction that I should make to the presentation, and that is the Catalan Observatory, which lasted for 2 years, was folded about a year and a half ago. So it's no longer there. They no longer exist. There used to be two. Stanford was one of two in the world, the other one at the London School of Economics. And for complex, but mostly, I should say, to give a very brief explanation for financial reasons, they have been folded. Anyway, how I think about literature. So if I take this phrase, this invitation literally, as I will, the invitation to address this topic, precisely how I think about literature, is nothing short of a provocation. A provocation to think about how I think about something that we generally agree to call literature. Now, these 5 words, how I think about literature, entail or contain a number of assumptions. First, that people think about literature. The stress on the I, obviously, on this particularity, obviously presupposes or implies a generality. I think about literature, others also, therefore, think about it. The second presupposition is that we are reasonably agreed on the meaning of literature, and that we think about it with Catholic latitude, which means that it has become an abstract concept rather than a collection of particulars. Third, that literature is something that, again, people think about regardless of whether or not they practice it. I suspect that if we were pressed for a more precise definition, our small community would probably break into factions about what counts as literature. The potential for taxonomic disagreement was brought home to me when a colleague asked some time ago whether there's such a thing as Catalan literature. So calling literature that X about which I'm expected to be thinking presumes that the object of my thought exists as a discernible source of experience, of mental experience in the first place, of aesthetic, perhaps ethical, some might say political experiences secondarily. And since I'm asked to think about literature as an object that generally fulfills these requirements, then it transpires that I'm invited to think outside the frame of specialty that in the space of literary reference, where that would be, in any case, a space of literary reference where most of us in this room would never meet. So I must, for the occasion, think about an object that we all identify within the field of our specialized discourses, and at the same time, I must think about it outside, or if you will, perhaps on the threshold of this field. Do not expect, therefore, that I will be speaking about Iberian studies, or don't expect me to promote what some in this room consider, and I don't know why, certainly, my particular expertise. I believe that the demand on me tonight, in fact, is more radical than any of that, for it presumes not only that I think about literature, but also that I know how to do it, how I do it. And it presupposes, therefore, self-reflexivity and also I find this highly problematic, a sense of method. Furthermore, the overall theme contains a question, an abîme. Stated in the guise of an assertion, this question is, namely, that I think about literature, that I know how I do it, and that I am capable of explaining it. In all of these presuppositions, what is in abîme is a question that can be variously formulated as, how do I think about literature? How can I think about literature? Do I think about literature? How do I think about literature? And so on and so forth. To do justice to any of those questions, which are implicit in the theme proposed, I must try to restore the phenomenon literature to its predisciplinary appearance, unencumbered by all those adventitious sets of concepts and of concerns which we have erected in the name of theory. In taking the questions latent in how I think about literature earnestly and putting aside my so-called expertise, I'm clearly taking a risk. If I'm foolhardy enough to come before you without donning the armor of a specialty, it's not because I'm at this moment overly self-confident, because without the shield of my specialization, I actually feel quite vulnerable to your intelligence. It's rather that, having committed to this public confession of faith in our putative common enterprise, I realized that pledges of loyalty are empty unless one takes the challenge personally. That is, unless I forgo the chance to impose on you my programmatic concerns, or perhaps an excerpt from the book that I happen to be working on at this time, and instead of that, I'm willing to take the question at face value. And obviously, I've chosen the second course. By doing so, I make things hard for myself. For the very moment that I put aside the critical superfetations and the authoritative citations that vouch for my belonging to the professorial caste, I become aware that I cannot isolate the essence of literature in the way that the physicist isolates subatomic particles, or the biochemist might isolate a genetic code. I cannot simply ask, qu'est-ce qu'est la littérature? And then come up with an answer that tries to go beyond Sartre's plea for political commitment. Political answers to the question, what is literature, tend to apply circular reasoning. If one starts from an invasive sense of politics, how can then one fail to discover the political inside or at the core of the texts? In a broad sense, this is obviously a truism, insofar as the uses of the book that we call literary, or that we identify as literary, in fact, required at some point economic, material, and educational preconditions, which, as George Steiner pointed out already a number of decades ago, precisely in 1972, hardly predate the late 16th century in Europe, in Western Europe, in fact, but also those parts of the world in which European influence was felt. But is it actually as a genteel stand-in for political struggle that literature rose to cultural eminence during the era that we now might call the era of the book? Although the preconditions for the rise of literature are present today in large parts of the world, literary practice and connoisseurship are subject to Darwinian forces in the publication business, are subject to competition from the visual media, as well as pressure on canon formation, on value assessment, and ultimately on the establishment of individual reputations and, of course, institutional influence. These ensemble of practices constitute what Pierre Bourdieu called a habitus, and we are forced to think our object in relation to this habitus, which is predicated on literature's residual value in our post-literary society. But at the same time that we accept this situation, or we have to accept this situation in the name of the reality principle, right? We still continue to think about literature as primordial, as something that people still encounter outside the glass cabinet of the academy and experience not in the poverty of deficient literary reference, but in the exhilaration of entering a world made with the substance of meaning. How I think about literature foregrounds the relation between an action, this thinking, which is predicated of a subject, an I, which is not to be understood biographically, and an object, literature, that governs the phrase semantically and clearly determines it. Literature is what the subject thinks about, whether we understand the subject as the I that speaks at this very moment, or as a syndicated subject representing a profession. Thinking is the relation between the subject that thinks and the object that appears to the subject in its thinking. The relation that we entertain with the majority of objects in our normal everyday life tends to be pre-logical and most of the time pre-reflexive. But as a linguistic object ruled by logos, literature has thinking at its core and reveals itself through precisely thoughtful action. Now, I don't say intellectual action, because the term implies a sophistication that may or may not supervene, and is thus non-essential to literature's enjoyment. The deliberate acts of thought by which literature is revealed come under the headings of interpretation, comprehending, and appreciating, all of which are integral aspects of reading. The thinking that we invoke when we say that we think about literature is no casual relation that one can replace ad libitum. For instance, by admiring the cover of a book or other paratextual details of the publication. Rather, it is a constitutive relation. In this phrase, the word about is the linchpin between an intentionality and an entity, in relation to which the thinking I is precisely, exactly a reading I. This I is, on the other hand, no pure subjectivity, since the thinking involved in the phrase, how I think about literature, is neither a pure act of reflection nor a principle of ontological discrimination. It does not invest the I with thought by depriving the object of it, in a way that, if this were true, in a way that would make the reader the effective author, or what amounts to the same thing, the sole authority for the text's meaning. Rather, as, and I quote him again, as George Steiner observed, to read is, he says, a supremely active, collaborative, yet also agonistic affinity, whose logical, if not actual fulfillment, is at answering text. The thinking at stake in the question about literature does not constitute the I in a mediated reflexivity, but through something about which it thinks and through which it modifies itself. This something could be easily mistaken for alienated thought, that is, thought that misrecognizes itself as an object in the sense of something produced. But literature is, in fact, transformative, by virtue of our engaging with it in a way that reveals thought not as subjective self-presence, but rather as world presence and presence to the world. Now, that's something through which thought recognizes itself in its relation to things is what we call signification. Literature is, before anything else, a significant environment, a milieu of signs. Reading entails looking attentively to signs that point to what? Signs that point to a pre-signifying collective or world of things. And so we arrive at a notion of reading as thoughtful attention to a previous indexing of the world. And attention obviously implies selection, that is, discrimination between signs. Legere, to read, Latin, to read, means to choose in its very first acceptation. In its second acceptation, it means to collect, to gather. Only later historically, did it come to mean to read aloud, as reading, in fact, was practiced for centuries. People didn't read silently, they read aloud. It does seem that the silent reading that is at the basis of a modern library and of our own practices most of the time is a comparatively recent development. Although it has ultimately become a rare sight, certainly in the West, some of us, I think most of us, probably all of us, have at some point or other observed semi-literate people actually accompany their reading with lip movements. The Latin term lectio, which stands for a voiced reading, the word from which we also get the terms lesson and lecture, as well as selection, implied a choice that collects and brings something together. Although Latin distinguished between the soft murmur of private reading, which is called sibi legere, reading to oneself, and the full-voiced reading, clara lectio, the morphology of the Romance languages did not mark the passage from the physical to mental reading. So we have Lectura, Lectura, Lecture. The German lesen, like the Latin legere, conveyed a physical activity of gathering, and in fact that which is read. In German, you read the Buchstaben, so the letters. Those Buchstaben were originally the rods of beechwood on which runes were inscribed. German resorts to the Latin cultism, Lektüre, to designate the concentrated reading over a span of time, reserving the word Lesung for the activity of reading to an audience. So I will not get into, it's complicated, but the implications of this shift, this historical shift towards silent reading. I just wish to point out that what reading collects by putting together the signs that it finds on the page is in fact an order in which our entire ontological situation is implicated. We call such ordering of signs making sense. It is the means by which our thought finds composure, establishing a provisional balance between inner and outer experience. Now, you all know that certain theories lay stress on the reader's agency in creating the sense of the text. If we push it to an extreme, this stance supports the notion of the reader's co-authorship, which in turn gives rise to the view that there's no true criterion by which to measure the adequacy of the reading. On the other end, we encounter the belief that complexity per se breeds significance, in blatant denial of the scientific principle that economy of means is a gauge of a theory's value. And I would here refer you to the, absolutely perverse Sokal affair, right, where complexity in itself was taken as the main criterion for the validity of certain texts. Either position, in any case, breeds relativism, which is the attitude that Proust's great aunt, who considered literature, I quote, fancy's floating terrain where one single person's taste cannot establish the truth, was established. Most of us, I'd say, today, tend to agree with Proust's great aunt. We have come a long way from our medieval predecessors who believed that truth actually inhered in the book. We favor indeterminacy, confusing this notion with the inability to establish any meaning whatsoever. In physics, where the concept of indeterminacy originated, it refers to the difficulty in reaching a neutral knowledge or a disembodied knowledge due to the effect of observation on the phenomenon being observed. Applied to literature, the indeterminacy principle should make us aware not only that our relative approaches to texts produce limited interpretations, or that circumstances, say, of age, class, gender, exposure to literary history, race, whatever, and so on, that all of these particular circumstances do put pressure on our readings. We should be aware of that, but also that these specificities, these situations, do not make of literature an experience in futility, but rather one that calls for readings ever more informed by the total context of meaning. Today, generally speaking, the great aunt's principle triumphs in the classroom. We encourage our students to think critically before they possess literary competence. In the process, we throw away the principle of adequacy, which is like removing the net from a tennis court before the game. Unlike his great aunt, so he talks about her, but then comes Proust's own opinion. Proust differed from his great aunt because he worked from a different assumption. He saw the writer's task as producing a vision, an alteration of the world. With the greatest effort, the writer succeeds in partially lifting the layer of insignificance that leaves us indifferent to the universe. I quote from Proust, "Look, learn to see, and then it disappears. This is the price of reading and also its insufficiency." This is Proust. Proust attacks the presumption of turning this moment into a discipline. He believed that organizing the vision into a curriculum was a doomed project, a conceited effort to systematize what is merely an initiation. I quote again, "Reading," he says, "is at the threshold of spiritual life. It can introduce us to it, but it's not that life." Let us put aside the issue of discipline to focus on the vision that reading discloses, however fleetingly. Proust does not suggest that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. or that the reader chooses his or her own vision within the artistic work. Speaking of the landscapes that inspired the Impressionist painters, he says that the places themselves were indifferent. Their appearing more beautiful than the rest of the world was not due to an intrinsic quality, but to a slight modification that the artist had interposed between their ordinary appearance and his own rendition. The modification consists in an imperceptible layer of spirit that constitutes the essence of the vision. If the vision were ordinarily available, then the artist would be superfluous. We would not need art. Proust's great aunt was a relativist, but only in literary matters. Where she could invoke a set of rules or principles, such as in cooking, or playing Beethoven's sonatas, or in the art of graceful hosting, she was capable of judging perfection and the exact degree by which people departed from it. University administrations exhibit the same discrimination when assessing contributions to the sciences. But like Proust's great aunt, they find it more difficult to use discernment in the humanities. When the writer succeeds in lifting the veil of indifference and exposing a deeper truth about the world, the part of the world that stands revealed is at that moment freed for the possibility of realization. The vision is itself that freeing, and the object at that moment is pried loose from the background of general insignificance. So let us call that background our pragmatic relation to the world. Because this relation deals with horizons of immediacy, it is necessarily short-sighted. Genuine art opens a horizon of understanding by delivering us to our primordial vulnerability in face of the world as newly revealed by the artist. We are simply at a loss. We don't know how to deal with that new thing. Well, all and good, but if the reader grasps the vision, then he or she must possess some prior intuition of what the signs point to, of where to look, or at least what to look for in a text. This implicit knowledge, which we claim training refines, facilitates the reader's collaboration with the text. It accounts for the expectation that when the writer says, "Look," the reader will turn to the signified object and engage with its signs. The vision will certainly be more or less profound, but the odds are that it will produce an area of fundamental agreement, even if the scope of semiotic relevance varies from one reader to the next. And there's nothing mystical about this coincidence. We do, in fact, tend to see the same basic patterns in a text, much as we discern the Cathedral of Rouen in Monet's various renderings of that building under different light. And this is, I'd say, very good news. Because without this fundamental agreement, reading could not be taught, even at the level of just the bare decoding of the signs or the deciphering of the codes. The reason for the potential agreement across interpretive communities is not the deep structural presence in the text of universal principles of organization, but more simply, the fact that we relate to each other as signifying beings. I cannot make sense of the world by myself or for myself alone. So the topical question, what book would I take to a desert island, is absurd, because I cannot anticipate the conditions under which my reading would proceed once I were there, nor can I anticipate my spiritual needs under those conditions. Radically formulated, the question should be, what book would you read in death row the evening before your execution? But is one still interested in reading, or even capable of interpreting signs when one is about to leave behind the regions of metaphor? Wasn't this the theological problem that extreme unction posed for Catholics in relation to sinners whose terminal condition prevented them from undergoing confession and penance? Would the anointment of the senses and the accompanying prayers retain their efficacy on a subject deprived by accident or terminal disease of the powers of semiological transformation? I mean, this really was debated. We know what the Church decided in the end, that although the dying person, the person taking the viaticum, is supposed to be in a condition, in a reasonable condition, where he or she can understand what's going on, the Church magnanimously allows, in very exceptional circumstances, to give the viaticum to people who've lost their powers and their wits. Now, this extreme case poses starkly the problem of literature's functionality. And at this point, the question is no longer how I think about literature, but rather what I think literature is good for, what it does for me. In his 84th letter to Lucilius, Seneca the Younger opposes reading to studying. Reading, he says, restores the mind exhausted from studying, not, however, without further study. So there's a little bit of a paradox. Now, there's no question here of literature being a first-century variant of our infotainment, something to lighten a more demanding curricula while still getting the credits. Studium meant for Seneca not only an endeavor that required exertion, but also an inclination and a fondness that engendered assiduity. Reading was only one side of the studium. The other was writing. As writing uses up energy, reading restores it by bringing both activities into balance. I quote again from Seneca. He says, "It is necessary to shuttle back and forth between the one and the other so that the pen gives a unified structure to everything that reading has previously collected." By unifying what was dispersed and incorporating it into the subject, writing produces personality. The original phrase in Latin is stylus redigat in corpus. The pen unifies or integrates into the body. Stylus, the pointed utensil which Romans used to inscribe wax tablets, gives us the word style, which we associate with a distinctive way of producing signs. The past participle of redigo, redactus, gives the word redacted, with which we obviously designate something in the production of which writing intervenes. And corpus is, of course, the body resulting from the unification of elements, a body that criticism breaks down into its component parts by means of analysis. For Seneca, the body resulting from the integration of foreign elements was indistinguishable from the person. He compares reading to the organic assimilation of food, describing it as the appropriation of someone else's thought. It is not a question of plagiarism for him, but rather of transformation. It's not imitatio in the strong sense of the term. He says, let us digest it, otherwise these things will go to the memory, so no erudition. They will go to the memory, not to the intelligence, ingenium. This phrase bears on the problem of literary origination that Harold Bloom discussed under the term anxiety of influence. Antiquity was ostensibly free from this anxiety, an anxiety that so much troubled the Romantic and post-Romantic writers. Seneca is not anxious at all about the generative law that governs body and intellect alike. Now, if you excuse a heavy anachronism, I would say that he envisioned the task of supplanting the father as cannibalizing rather than sublimating. I quote once more, "And even if you should betray a similarity to someone who was deeply established in you through admiration, I want you to resemble him as a son, not as an image." The portrait, he asserts, is a dead thing. For him, for Seneca, organic assimilation of an alien consciousness permitted the emergence of a distinct entity. And this assimilation took place through reading. If reading and writing plow the ground for future individuation, why do we think about literature instead of just reading it, doing it? Why do we raise our dealings with books to the level of reflexivity? Why do we think about how we think about literature? And why do we maintain a pedagogical relation to it? What indeed is there to teach? If nothing, in the sense of an object to be mastered and hitched to the will, then our difficulties in justifying a nothing that is nonetheless pregnant with experience would explain the decline of the literary disciplines in an era of receding referential recognition. Is bookish literacy a discipline after all? If the answer is a tentative dragging the feet yes, then it must be, in a sense, different from those other disciplines that thrive on the systematization of their objects. But if literature is not governed by a universal set of rules, if it is not a knowledge-fostering discipline in the sense in which knowledge is understood today as applicable expertise, then we must assign it to the liberal arts. These, as you know, mean, in very loose etymology, the useless arts. The free or unbound arts practiced by people who possess otium, the opposite of those who are in business. Their decline today raises the question of the degree of objective freedom in a society driven by economic necessity. It also casts doubt on the adaptive efforts undertaken on behalf of their survival. As Steiner observed 4 decades ago, the presuppositions and psychological attitudes that made possible the fabric of Western literacy have been under attack for some time. He blamed it on the organized amnesia of American schooling, and of course, on its imitation elsewhere, particularly in Europe. Seneca, for his part, let's go back to this guy in the 1st century, an Iberian, by the way. Seneca was unimpressed by the formal education of his own day. Can you believe, he says, can you believe that there is any good in these arts, whose professors are, as you can see, dishonest and the most disgraceful of men? He refers quite specifically to the grammaticus, the language and literature professor. None of the things that this guy teaches, the grammaticus, clear the way for virtue. If literature does not teach virtue and literary scholars are far from exemplary, what is it good for? What are we good for? The question presupposes a pragmatic goal and could be answered by saying that a liberal education should aim for virtue as a technique of living. But if literature professors, turpissimos omnium, cannot initiate students to higher forms of being, should literature then be abandoned altogether? He asks, why do we educate our children in the liberal arts after all? And answers himself, not because they can furnish virtue, but because they prepare the soul to receive it. Well, the Middle Ages also saw virtue as both a precondition and as the goal of reading. In the Didascalicon, which was a 12th century sort of bulletin of the curriculum, Hugh of St. Victor wrote about the virtues required for reading. For him, successful reading leads to a discovery of the self and its eventual perfection. Few retain today such exalted notion of reading. Ivan Illich, who studied Hugh of St. Victor, pointed out that this idea of reading is as culturally obsolete as the causa finalis. And yet, I would say, literature understood as propedeutic to an enhanced inner life may still be worthy of consideration. After all, life is spent, for the most part, in expectation of better things. Without that expectation, life loses luster, dwindles, and sinks into spiritual indigence. Are we now going to plead, or am I pleading for a moralizing literature? Now, to avoid equivocation, we need to settle, in any case, on a definition of virtue. But since I'm not able to even broach that question, let alone settle it, I stop on my tracks. However, let us agree, perhaps, for the sake of the argument, that virtue presupposes consciousness of the challenges and consequences of living with others, including the others that went before, the makers of the formal tradition of literature. Does this mean that literature converges with ethics or with sociology? Studying literature for the sake of the role models or of the social values that it contains seems to me as misplaced as reading books for the sake of the articles that one will write about them afterwards. Both are reductive forms of instrumentality. In a famous passage On Anger, Seneca explains that he examines himself every evening. Now, without abusing the text, I think, although this is again pretty much under discussion, whether or not Seneca had developed a sense of self-reflexivity, I think that it is possible to posit that indeed, that he was engaged in self-reflexivity. And though reflexivity per se may not be virtuous in itself, it is nevertheless the precondition for virtue. So I'll hazard the opinion that reflexivity is a historical product of reading, and that in time, the examination of text rebounds as self-examination. Because texts deal with impressions on the mind, and because the techniques of reading do so, they eventually develop into techniques of the self. One reason literature has such a stronghold on some people is the impression that without necessarily becoming better or more intelligent in real life, one seems closer to this goal while one is immersed in a book. This expansive sense of self may be what Seneca had in mind when he wrote that the liberal arts do not make anyone better, but prepare the ground for the improvement. When we read the great works of the past, we are aware of treading among the monuments of worlds that have been. Reading literature is a form of excavation, a desublimating encounter with death. This is true also of not only the works from the past, but also of contemporary works. We are never in attendance at the creative moment. In consequence of our inescapable hindsight, we are thrown back upon the expediency of interpretation. It is tempting to associate this underlying belatedness with Heidegger's thrownness as being toward the end. Alphabetic writing, from which literature emerges, exacts a lineal motion from the mind. Reading is a process of self-discovery modulated by the interaction between the mind and the page. This process is analogous to the decipherment of that possibility which Heidegger calls one's unmost. We read on with the expectation of a full disclosure that would bring about the end of reading. What induces us to read and keeps us reading over a lifetime is the intuition that origination, originality, and death are co-primordial. Death is the supremely self-originating act, the true harbinger of individual destiny. But confronting this possibility existentially cannot be learned or taught theoretically, but only in the anxiety that militates against apathy. For Heidegger, anxiety has nothing to do with being influenced by a precursor, but is, and I quote, the disclosedness of the fact that Dasein exists as thrown being towards its end. Reading grants us immediate experience of being towards the end, not only in the teleological movement of the texts, but above all in their great mythical patterns, which reveal Dasein as always ahead of itself. Again, I'm quoting Heidegger's terms. In this confrontation of the self with itself in the mirror of the page lies literature's difference from communicational, technical, or scientific texts. These relational forms of writing belong to the collective self, which establishes the practical, world-oriented context of significance, and which, according to Heidegger, prevents Dasein from discovering the world in its own way. The difference between texts meant to exhaust their usefulness in explanations of the immediate situation and texts that set the reader on the path to self-recognition, or as Heidegger says, or might say, unconcealment, both distinguishes and imperils literature as a social value and an academic endeavor. But the extent to which one form of writing prevails over the other has changed, and doubtless will continue to change in the course of history. Thank you. So I'm open to questions. Marilia, I think. Oops. Marilia.
Well, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate your talk. And first of all, because my next class on Manifesto Anthropófagos will start with Seneca and his organic food incorporation. But besides this, I really appreciate. And two quick things. The first one is that your position reminds me of a text that I have just reread from Lyotard, speaking about the scientific technological environment and how they are producing machines to supply, for example, mind productions or body productions. But one of the points that he makes is that to think, to write, and to read implies, the question that he asks is, are your machines able to suffer? Because to write and to read implies a level of sufferance, because we always want to say something when we are writing in the midst of everything that has been already said. And this implies a certain sufferance that is related to our body. So the connection between body and mind implied in this. So, and this seems something similar to your point in terms of reading literature implying vulnerability, not a pragmatic goal immediately, and also this idea that I cannot say what I will bring to an island to read, precisely because I don't know how I will feel there, right? So I need to be surrounded by books, and then I can choose. But and then my question goes in this sense that what for you, how can you define the difference for you of reading, and you put very beautifully how our profession could be related to this very specific act of reading and teaching it, right? This is very beautiful, simple in this beautiful. But so how do you think about the difference between reading Heidegger philosophical texts in general and literary texts? Because both can deal with sufferance or vulnerability, but can you say some words about how do you think the specificity?
Okay, thank you very much. Your question actually contains a string of very nice things at the beginning that then you leave aside when you pose the question, but I'd like to also relate to a couple of those. I like very much the point about the suffering and whether or not writing machines suffer. It brought immediately to my mind the Kafka text on the penal colony, because what he's subjected to is actually a writing machine, one that writes on the body. And I don't know if it's already been pointed out by people in German department, should know, but the torture that this character is subjected to could very well be the torture that Kafka feels as a writer. That is to say, one has to go on and do it, and it's always at the expense of one's blood. Then jumping to the question, I don't know to what extent one should make a clear-cut distinction between philosophy and literary text. Obviously, we distinguish the tonality. When I'm trying to read Hegel, I find it a lot harder than when I'm reading whatever, Unamuno Machado, or it's a different ballgame. But if I were to make a distinction, I'd say that perhaps the turning point is when the quote-unquote literary writer refuses to leave behind the world of the senses. That is to say, language, the suffering of this writer is tremendous because the literary author wants language, which is by definition an abstract thing, to convey something very physical, something that implies a bodily intuition of the world. We normally think of the philosophers as dealing with higher difficulty, which probably is the case, but that difficulty is the difficulty of abstracting, of conveying meaning once you have abstracted so much that you almost have no breathing room. I find Hegel to be quite, I gasp for air. But nevertheless, we also have to admit that historically, this parting of the ways has something to do with the development of techniques of reading. And then the question would be very complex to answer. As we know, it's not always been like this. Who was Seneca? Was he a literary author or a philosopher? What is it? I mean, what was Stoicism? Perhaps here we would be dealing of something that we have come to take for granted because we are in a bubble that we can hardly analyze since we live in it, but it's the development of modern specializations, the pushing to extremes of given forms of thinking and of expression of those thoughts. Zep, what's the...
Many thanks. This was, I think, a beautiful convergence between an approach that started out phenomenological in the very best tradition, the way you were unfolding the title for the first time, at least in those lectures that I've been attending of the series, and then coming in with this beautiful references mainly to Seneca and to Heidegger. That was a treat already. So my question starts out with reflexivity. I mean, I think your key definition or your key answer was the one we were saying with Seneca, that reading, in this sense, reading literature, where we cannot really say whether he meant reading literature in our sense. He clearly didn't mean it exactly the same way, but okay. Let's say reading literature is not so much leading you towards a certain type of virtue, whatever that may be, but intensifies your perception, your sensitivity in the direction of going there, right? I mean, that seemed to be a reading of the interpretation of Seneca's answer. Now, The first question would then be, does that necessarily imply reflexivity? I mean, the obvious answer is yes, but I've become a great fan of this very last text in the life of Richard Rorty, where he talks about somebody is asking him what would he have liked to read, and then everybody expected some philosophical opponent or yet another text by Kant. And then he says, in this, I mean, I kind of can hear his voice, and said, well, you know, I would have liked to learn a couple of more verses by heart, more poems by heart. And then they ask him in a very Richard Rorty way, so why? And he said, because they sound so beautiful. Now, this is, of course, Rorty being provocative, but, I mean, the question would be, can the mere sensitivity, this kind of, you know, nursery rhyme or whatever, just knowing them, and all those rhymes that we can all remember from elementary school, high school, you know, religious services, I mean, would that also contribute to this to this intensifying a certain perception towards virtue, without necessarily implying reflexivity? I mean, that's the question. Is there this modality? It's a real question. It's not a rhetorical question, because I think it has to be this way. And then, secondly, that is probably one we agree with. I mean, if it is about intensifying, sharpening a certain type of perception, that, of course, cannot imply, I would say, or can it imply, a guarantee that it would go in what you and I or some other people would consider the right direction or the wrong direction. I mean, you can then also biographically go in the Céline direction all of a sudden. I mean, he had read a lot of literature and was certainly very intense in his perception of the world. But, you know, I mean, however much I love to read Céline, but I cannot forget where this would take him. And not only in the 1930s, but throughout his life. And finally, I mean, this converges a lot with Marilia's question, and I was about to ask this Lyotard question about suffering. That's very, very important. Very basic, but one cannot help asking that. I mean, would you associate this potential function of literature, that I very much agree with the quality or property inherent to the text? I mean, in the traditional sense of saying literary texts are those characterized by features A, B, C, or would you say this has to do with a specific pragmatic situation that, at least from early modernity on, and maybe within classical antiquity, implies some playfulness, which would then perhaps establish a certain degree of difference with philosophical reading? I mean, not only the difficulty that you underline of philosophical reading, because, I mean, I think, I mean, in the sense you meant, reading Hölderlin is about as breathtaking, in your sense, as reading his friend Hegel. I mean, that is not really the difference, but there is a playfulness, not acute playfulness, but a playfulness of complexity implied in reading a poem that one would not pragmatically imply in reading Hegel, for example.
Okay, well, that's a lot of ammunition here, and I may actually have to call back on you to clarify if you feel that I'm not answering. First, the question of whether or not I would agree that it may not be. I mean, as I said when I was speaking. The issue whether or not Seneca was already engaged in reflexivity is up for grabs. I mean, philosophers of Seneca are debating that question. I know where you're coming from, because, you know, I'm a participant in the book on the reflexivity in relation to Niklas Luhmann. But what I'd like to say is that although I posited I presented the hypothesis that self-reflexivity may, in fact, be a consequence, a late consequence of the rise of reading and literature. There's another aspect to it, which is very obviously historically tied to religion. Right? In Seneca, when he says that he does the analysis of conscience every evening, is striding those two worlds. We have Augustine's Confessions and so on and so forth. So what would be the origin of self-reflexivity? It would be foolish for me to try to at this moment, create an ad hoc theory of where it arises. But I think that it definitely has to do with the phenomenon of consciousness, whereby the subject detaches him or herself or itself from the outer world. This development of something that one rejects from the self, one objectifies, and vis-a-vis which the consciousness posits itself. At that moment, there is the possibility of the phenomenon of the second-order observer, in the sense that what becomes available for the observation of the subject is no longer the objects in the world, but the observation itself. So if I catch myself observing, if I take a step back and I realize that my relation to the world is no longer direct and mediated, but it's mediated through whatever, through mind, through consciousness, at that moment I think that one can speak fully about reflexivity. In this sense, when Seneca nightly calls the role of his actions during the day and begins evaluating them in whichever sense, I think that he has already stepped into that realm in which there is an added distance between the things that went before. That is to say, there's also the rising of a past, however immediate this past might be, in his consciousness, and then the act of observation which takes place at the present time. So time unfolds and opens up the space for self-reflexivity to step in. Secondly, Rorty and his sort of Socratic late in the game wish that he had done something else. Socrates, of course, began learning to play the flute or playing an instrument because of his daimon telling him, that's what you have neglected in your life. It may well be that poetry, we see that also in Heidegger, poetry is a little bit in some ways, the regret of the philosopher. And maybe for precisely the same reasons that I was pointing out to Marilia in my response to Marilia, that there's a parting of the ways in which something is sacrificed on either side. The poets, some poets also tend to produce very reflective poetry, not merely musical or sensual poetry. And then, of course, some of these do become the pet poets of philosophers. Rilke, in the case of Heidegger. I mean, Rilke absorbs a lot of the thought of his day and then pours it into his wonderful Duino elegies and the sonnets to Orpheus. I wonder if that sense of regret doesn't play a role. But I think that the important aspect of the question there was and then it ties with the question of intensification of perception, whether or not we could envision some kind of teaching or pedagogical relation to literature that went beyond the conveyance, let's put it this way, the conveyance of the ideas or the concepts that one can extract from the literary works. And the answer is obviously yes, but when we do that, we are not discovering, it's the German expression, discovering gunpowder. Because that's exactly the way that people read in the High Middle Ages. When monks in the monasteries literally could read only aloud. They used to read aloud. In fact, in the scriptoria, there was a lot of noise because as people were copying the books, everybody was reading them aloud, right? I mean, they had people reading them, and then the clerks would be writing them. It was quite chaotic. Why? I mean, they had not yet developed the technique of silent reading. And what that meant was that when these people read, they were literally incorporating the sounds of what they were reading into their somatic makeup. Reading became part of the body. There's the expression, and I forget now who, could have been Hugh of St. Victor, somebody described what these monks were doing when they were reading as munching, chewing the words. And literally, once again, eating, anthropophagia. In this case, it was the mental appropriation abstracts from all that sensual aspect of language that can still be traced back to those other techniques of reading, and then we might revive. Maybe I should not allude to this, but I do recall vividly a lecture you gave years ago where you in fact harped on this possibility when you were reading Céline, no less, out aloud, and pointing out the rhythm and the fact that what Céline one of the reasons why we should, I think, continue to read Celine, notwithstanding his biography, is because he did wonderful things with language, and some of these wonderful things was the invention of a rhythm that's incorporated into the text. So why not? I mean, why should we discard great writers because of a very problematic life? And coming to the fourth, the playfulness. I think you were talking about properties inherent in the text. You might have to refresh my mind here.
Well, properties inherent to the text, or is it just
a pragmatic situation, right? I got, yeah. Okay, so I tried in the course of the talk to place myself somewhere in the middle of this, not because I'm afraid of going to the extremes, but because I honestly think that we cannot accept, we cannot embrace the some years ago popular position that there really is nothing in the text, that it's free for all, that we make meaning as we read, that any interpretation is a good interpretation because there's no good interpretation. Their texts are structured. I don't mean to say that if we can find out about the intention of the author, we possess the structure of the text. Authors sometimes, quite often in fact, are not fully aware of what they've done, what structure has been driving them, because they are part of a social world and definitely part of a reading world. But also, I don't like positioning myself in the position of saying, well, it all depends on what interpretive community you belong to. Stanley Fish's position, you belong to this one or to that one, you're at this end of the hall or that end of the hall, and that's what more or less determines the way that you read texts. I will not deny in the least that there's playfulness inherent in the very act of writing. Obviously, literary texts have that quality, and also playfulness in the act of reading. Is to say, we try things out. We don't come to a text, or we should not come to a text. I tell this to my students all the time, don't come to the text feeling that you already have the key or the codes how to go about interpreting these texts. Let the text speak to you. But when you say that, you're already affirming eo ipso the fact that the text has something to say to you. So you have to listen to what the text is saying, and then your reception is very much your own responsibility. So the pragmatic situation does count, has weight, but it's a situation in which it balances the weight that comes from the pragmatic situation of the creative act, of the writing of the text in the first place. So I don't know if I answered more or less.
Yes, of course.
Hector.
Thank you, Ramon. That was wonderful. I'll imitate Maria and Seb in the format. 3 things I underlined and also 3 questions. I appreciated your taking the invitation to heart. I think that was fabulous. And that definition of literature as a milieu of science is something to munch on, if you will. Your emphasis on adequacy before critical reading, I think, is very fortunate. And in a pedagogical setting as ours, I think that's also a useful reminder. And of course, as has been already pointed out, the idea of reflexivity as being the result of reading is also a line of research by itself. So kudos on those, and I could go on. My 3 questions, or actually 2 questions and an invitation, are: 1, if time permits, if you could elaborate a little bit on the place of collectivity and of community. You unpacked the question very nicely, how I think about literature. That is, of course, the framing of our series, but there is also the we, and some of the things that you said already hinted at that, but I was hoping to hear more about the collective dimension of this. Secondly, I was thinking of another Iberian author, Jorge Manrique, and the Coplas a la muerte de su padre, and it struck me that that kind of text is not being ahead of death, but having passed death, having lived through death. So that is not actually my question. My invitation would be for you to perhaps tell us a little bit about more contemporary Iberian authors that might be in the background of your thinking about these issues. I was trying to guess some perhaps the great Notebook. I just wanted to put that invitation out there. And finally, and please feel free to answer to some of these or all of them, since you used etymology, I think, very convincingly. As you know, virtus is also related to vir, to the man. And that perhaps could be problematic. I mean, could we perhaps think about reading as a vir, right, or reading as a woman? Is that something that you might, consider or not?
Okay, very good. Well, was this the question or was this the point? All right. Okay, so I'll try to answer the first question as well as I can. I know also your personal inclinations, intellectual inclinations. I did not focus on collectivity, although it clearly is an aspect of this. I alluded to it a couple of times, as you say. And I think that the moment when this became most explicit is when I said, I cannot make meaning for myself alone. We are, above all, in a collective of meaning-making beings. And that means, we're part of humanity. Humanity is defined as such. We have the capacity to create signs and to decode them. Once that is established, then we belong to a good number of communities or collectivities that have inherent interests. And also that's why I said at the very beginning, I'm not going to be here representing Iberian studies, because that would immediately fraction this audience. Most of you, all of you would politely listen, but very few of you would, very, very few of you would actually be in the community and therefore understand or relate to it from inside. So I discarded that right from the beginning, not interested in presenting that view. Nevertheless, since you bring it up, then we have to think about it. I mean, you are somebody who's currently very interested in what people call, in a Goethean phrase, Weltliteratur, right? Which was problematic when Goethe established it. And it seems to me to continue to be problematic today, but some people believe that that's the way to go, and so that's the way they will go. That concept assumes that communities of interpretation can be, in fact, surpassed and resolved in some kind of higher, larger category that does away with the differences in interpretation that begin with the differences in relation to particular objects. I'm more in this sense Hegelian. If I understand Hegel, the little tiny bit that I understand, that the particular is already the concrete universal. And it's here, rather than in the death thing, that I would relate to Pla. The reason I'm interested in Josep Pla and why this is the subject of my current book, which I have not wanted to present to you tonight, is because I think he is one of the greatest authors of his time, precisely because in a very clear-sighted, clear-minded way, turns away from everything that was fashionable, that was intellectually respectable at his time, and then becomes a precursor for us, since he adheres strictly to what can be inducted through the senses. So his world is a sensual world, a full world of the senses, and his main problem is how to bring that world to language. Manrique, death, so yes, I mean, if you really push me, Platt talks about death a little, not much. It's a topic that he avoids, obviously, probably he doesn't like it. There's one or two stories in which he talks about funerals, but no, I didn't really have anybody in mind. You could say I've been reading Kierkegaard recently, I don't know. And Virtus, certainly, yes. None of these classic authors had women writers in mind. Not even Sappho, right, who would be perhaps a potential reference. I don't know if Seneca would go, I mean, the kind of thinker and writer that he was, he might not have been so much interested in lyric poetry to begin with, and then the kind of poetry that Sappho produced. But virtue, and also a very pedestrian acceptation of the word, means strength, right? So strength we can translate easily into ability. And we can, of course, debate all night whether or not that continues to be sexist, but if we focus on virtue as ability, and specifically, as I tried to point out, as the ability to come into contact with oneself through reading, I really think that we can begin to dissipate the notion instituted in classical, and not only classical, but up to almost our own days, that literature was purely the preserve of men. Monica.
These are two tiny things. One is just a comment about that. Christian idea of virtue is somewhat different from vir and ability, and it has more to do with restraint.
Okay.
And in that, then I think we think of it as more of feminine or feminized or self-sacrificing kind of virtue. The Russians, philosophers like Solovyov talked about the Christian religion as one that actually created an androgynous being who was not a man, and and the virtue of those people was abnegation rather than ability.
Okay.
The question that I had was actually, it probably is kind of slightly outside of your talk, but it has to do with observatory, because you've brought up observation having to do with reflexivity and the ability to observe oneself through the experience of reading. And so I couldn't help thinking about your Catalan observatory and wondering, you know, and you also mentioned physics and the observatory that functions as a place that observes the phenomena of physics, and those are invisible phenomena really that have to be observed over long periods of time and through surfaces and all of these things. And so I just wondered why you used the word observatory for your Catalan.
A very easy answer. I did not.
Oh, well, that's too easy. Then,
You cannot make me responsible for
but
something I didn't choose.
Can you then speculate about why? Because it's a really interesting word rather than society.
Yeah, and yeah, I know. Again, you know, I can only be responsible for what I institute. I did not, and again, the London one had the same title, Catalan Observatory. I thought it was pretty foolish. Alan Schutte agreed with me. You know, Alan thought the people will think it's a science observatory, but I could not argue with the people who were bringing the funds. Also, I don't know what was to be observed. I mean, really, the function of it while it lasted was to produce some exchange of know-how. Part of it because of my insistence. You know, they wanted me to direct it, and I said, well, look, but I'm a humanities person, so if I do it, there has to be some humanities, and they accepted that. But they were interested in other areas of the university. And the function of it, in principle, had to be for people coming from Catalonia to obtain knowledge from specialists in various areas at Stanford, and also to exchange things. Yeah, that was all.
That's so disillusioning.
Yeah, but the good but the good news is that you know, once you have a little leverage, then of course I diverted some of the funds towards humanities things, and we did the you know, the wonderful well, that's it could well be. I mean, they were not very happy with the idea of just doing humanities. Humanities are also being downsized tremendously over there. Yeah.
So I wanted to thank you for
My pleasure.
making yourself vulnerable, as you said, by not giving us a section of what you're working on for something else, but really unpacking the title of the series, and with all of the kind of self-exposing that created, I'm really grateful, and I think it's done something for the series and for our whole community. And then I have a question, which is, you touched on it a little bit in response to Zep, but I'd like to hear you talk a little more about how or whether, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, it is still a discipline and we still do teach it. Right. So do you find that the ideas that you outlined about reading as a practice that leads to self-reflexivity and perhaps ultimately to virtue, does this enter into your classroom? When do you, is it there all the time? Is it there some of the time? How much are you kind of planning for it? How much are you doing the kind of more boring things, just producing an adequate reading? No, really, Iberian is in Europe, that kind of thing.
Yes. No, this is, I thought a little bit about this before the talk, so I'm honest, because I thought that it would be a question that somebody might ask, and you're the one, you know, clearly. I cannot really, I'm not the one who's authorized to say this, really, it would be my students. There's one just behind you who might actually tell you in your ear. But I don't lay out a plan in this sense. You know, I don't go into the classroom expecting to put students on the path of virtue. But something that's very gratifying about Stanford students, and I mean this, as you pointed out, I've taught at a number of universities, some of them very prestigious, but nowhere as at Stanford have I found, and I don't know if it's Stanford or if it's just the difference in the historical moment, the circumstances, students who in fact are very patient in the sense of willing to listen, rather than immediately wanting to tell you their that gut reaction to text, which it is that gut reaction, the thing that we really have to be careful to put a stop to, not in the sense of clipping their wings, but in the sense of helping them, open them up better. Here, Harold Bloom's, there's a comment by Harold Bloom that comes to mind, where he says, in this whole context of the anxiety of influence, that what the poet does to defend himself or herself from the power of the precursor, it is actually a struggle for life, it leads him to acts of savagery, and I forget what the other, a very strong term, savagery and whatever. And then he says, perhaps what our mission, our pedagogical mission in teaching literature would be to help the students, or to put the students, help them, in fact, pull back, get away from the power of the imagination. And then he immediately says, but if this were to be taken in absolute terms, we would, of course, kill their imagination. This is not the path to go. But it is interesting that he says, they have to be tamed. Why? Because we don't teach them, we don't prepare them to be poets. The poetic act for Bloom is an Oedipal act. They go and kill the father. Whereas what we are trying to do is to bring them into relation with the very many fathers and mothers. That is to say, bring them into a community of understanding and interpretation and appreciation. But for that to take place, as with little children, you have to curb their immediate instincts and bring them into the compass of more rational acts of interpretation. And that I do hope to be contributing at Stanford.
Let us thank our speakers.
Okay, thanks.